Welcome, class! Grab a seat. I'm your professor for today as explainer, and man, do we have a fascinating topic lined up. We're going to learn exactly how to read the ghosts of industry hiding right in our own local landscapes. You know, if you take a drive down the two-lane highways of southeast Alabama today, past the shiny new strip malls and deep into the rural interior, you are going to bump into a landscape that's literally dotted with faded skeletons. Now, these aren't just empty buildings, absolutely not. They are monuments to a wild, volatile economic engine that built and then totally abandoned the modern South.
Okay, let's dive right into today's syllabus. We're covering 6 quick modules. 1. The Green Gold Rush. 2. Shifting routes and agricultural pests. 3. Evidence in vernacular architecture. 4. The environmental legacy. 5. Main Street rebirths. And 6. Preserving historical identity. We're basically tracing the whole arc of the Southeast, from the raw, extractive booms of the 19th century all the way to these modern downtown rebirths.
All right, Section 1, the Green Gold Rush, the turpentine and timber booms.
We're starting this masterclass by throwing ourselves right into the raw extractive era of the Alabama wiregrass region. Way before peanuts and cotton took over the soil, the very first massive industry here was turpentine. The whole region was blanketed in these dense, old-growth, longleaf pine forests, basically a perfect natural factory. And around 1840, the invention of mobile copper stills completely revolutionized the local economy. Before this, processing was super limited, but these smaller stills, they were a total game changer. They allowed the naval stores industry to move deep into the woods, processing turpentine, pitch, and resin right at the source, which, by the way, the British Navy desperately needed just to waterproof their wooden ships.
But to get that sap, workers had to perform some seriously grueling physical labor. We're talking chopping, recurring, V-shaped cuts into the trunks of literally thousands of longleaf pines. Because the pattern looked kind of like whiskers, they called it a cat face. It was brutal, back-breaking work, mostly done by a highly transient workforce that just moved from camp to camp as the trees were tapped. Just a single, sticky drop of that pine resin was the green gold fueling the early rural economy. But, as you might guess, turpentining eventually totally exhausted the trees. Once that sap flow slowed down and the forests were overtapped, operators didn't stick around. They just moved on. They sold those depleted, scarred woods to a new, even more voracious master, the industrial timber barons.
So, let's look at the lumber boom. Operations like the Jackson Lumber Company completely defined town life. See, when the railroads arrived, companies could finally access the deep, deep interior. They set up these instant, transient communities that existed for one reason only, to feed giant saws. Get this, the Jackson Lumber Company's massive mill at Lockhart was cutting 2,000 trees in a single day. No way a forest sustains that forever, right? These weren't diverse towns built to last. They were mono-economies that absolutely dictated exactly where workers lived and moved.
Moving to Module 2, Shifting Routes and Agricultural Pests, the Slow-Motion Apocalypse.
The prosperity of those early company towns and bustling river ports, it was incredibly fragile. When the main economic driver vanished, the towns just hollowed out. Look at our primary case studies here. Columbia was once this thriving inland port on the Chattahoochee River, but the second new railroads bypassed it, the town withered. Then there's Otho, a bustling river hub with stagecoach traffic and even a 2-story hotel. But it was totally abandoned once automobiles took over and poor local roads left it isolated. And Pansy? Pansy was a super vibrant agricultural community that was absolutely devastated by a tiny insect, the boll weevil, in the 1910s. It was a complete economic collapse from which it never, ever recovered.
The really crucial takeaway here is that these regions didn't just vanish overnight. They didn't burn down in a single day. Well, actually, scratch that. Pansy did suffer from a later arsonist's fire, but you get the point. Generally, they fell victim to what we can call a slow-motion apocalypse, as their single-focus economies collapsed over decades.
And this decline was massively sped up by the cut-and-get-out logging mentality. Corporations back then didn't look at these ancient forests as a renewable resource, not at all. They saw them as a one-time treasure to be rapidly liquidated. So when the timber company packed up and moved to the next state over, they literally stripped all the ecological assets and left the workers with zero economic reason to stay.
All right, Section 3, Evidence in Vernacular Architecture, Reading the Landscape.
Let's take a bit of a visual field trip, shall we? We're going to analyze the physical remains left behind by these departed industries. This is where we learn to truly read the landscape. Photographers documenting these regions have captured silent churches, rusting grain silos, and completely hollowed-out general stores. As historians, we've got to look at these structures not just as sad ruins, but as primary artifacts. They're the physical, tangible evidence of the era's capitalism and the sheer scale of this massive rural transformation.
Check out the specific architectural evidence. Over in Lawrenceville, there's an 1830s jail built from double solid granite blocks. It's so incredibly heavy and substantial that it was simply impossible to remove when the town died. We also find rural stores built with these massive false fronts just to make them highly visible near the railroad tracks, often featuring large upstairs rooms used specifically for secret Masonic meetings. Oh, and old churches set up on blocks. That's a brilliant piece of vernacular design that gave them some much-needed ventilation in that suffocating southern heat.
Module 4, the environmental legacy, from stumpland to managed forests.
The extractive era didn't just break the towns, it totally broke the ecosystem. Contrast the absolute devastation of the early 1900s with what we see today. The original cut-and-get-out loggers left behind these barren, gullied stumplands covered in absolutely worthless scrub oak. But eventually the land healed. A lot of that sandy soil was reclaimed for peanut farming, and today, we see modern sustainable management. Fast-growing pine timber farming has made a massive comeback in the wiregrass, driven by huge global demand for wood pellets and pulp. It's this fascinating cycle of total destruction and managed rebirth.
Section 5, Main Street Rebirth, Community Agency in Action.
Let's pivot from rural decay to our next comparative lesson, the modern downtown rebirth, because the story of the South isn't just about what was left behind, it's very much about what's being reclaimed. Take the town of Jasper, Alabama. Before its recent revitalization, Jasper's downtown was described perfectly by this quote: "It was dead. You could park anywhere you wanted. Nobody walked the streets. It was essentially a modern ghost town, perfectly mirroring those hollowed-out settlements of the historical Wiregrass."
But here's the big comparative lesson for today's class. Those historic company towns, they were dictated entirely by rapid resource extraction. Once the timber was gone, the transient labor packed up and left. Modern successes like Jasper, though, are fundamentally different. They are resurrected through diverse, long-lasting community investment. They aren't banking everything on a single green gold resource. Instead, they're relying on civic engagement. It's a totally different ballgame.
And finally, Section 6, Preserving Historical Identity, the bridge between decay and rebirth.
Let's open our final module, looking at how we actually maintain our heritage moving forward. How do we make sure that when we save a town, we don't accidentally erase its history? Well, it's deliberate community agency, that active, conscious decision by residents to just believe in downtown again, that serves as the ultimate bridge between a decaying ghost town and a thriving modern landscape. It's about looking at those false front stores and old block churches and deciding, hey, these have real value beyond just the resources that built them.
So class, for your final exam, I want you to step outside, take a really close look at your own local landscapes, and ask yourselves this provocative question. Do our current revitalization efforts truly preserve local historical identity, or do they kind of just overwrite the ghosts of industry? When we rebuild, are we honoring the slow-motion apocalypse of the past, or are we just paving over the stumpland? Ponder that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you in the next lesson.